All right. Hey, it's Dev again. Kind of got through that whole Alien section of the discography last week, so I find it a little easier to continue. So here we are. Next one in line is Synchestra. And this album is actually quite hard to find. It's like a few of my records, it's not available anywhere really. But I did it. So if you are on YouTube, I'm sure you can find it. But this record basically marks a turning point for me in my career. I think it was right at the point towards the end of the recording of Alien where I recognized that the things that I wanted out of my life and career were not going to be able to be achieved by following that creative impulse. You know, the sort of destructive, chaotic, strapping young lad type of vibe. It's not that I disliked it, it's just, it wasn't for me, and it took me that long to sort of recognize it. And Synchestra was recorded simultaneously to Alien as, you know, Deconstruction, Ghost, SYL, Accelerated Evolution, Ocean Machine, City. I guess the difference between this one and SYL, Accelerated Evolution, is that it was started in terms of the writing during the same time period as Alien. But I waited until Alien was finished, until I really dug into it. And those 3 months that I had between the delivering of the Alien album to the record company and the release was the time that I ended up digging into Synchestra. And Synchestra was significant for me for a lot of reasons. I guess first, it's the first album that I mixed. It's the first album that I did at home. I did it on an iMac. It's the first time I allowed myself to be a little more honest with my lyrical approach to this side of my work. So as opposed to sort of veiling it in metaphor or what have you, it was a lot more direct, I think. And as I go through the lyrics for Synchestra, it's clear to me exactly what it was about. And what it was about, ultimately, was I needed a balm for what I felt I was doing to myself during the Alien period. I felt I had pushed myself to the point where I became psychologically unbalanced. And I needed to write something that acted as a counterbalance to the paranoia and the extremity of Alien, and also sort of explored similar themes. For example, whereas on Alien there was love, and that was sort of a cynical view of having kids or possessions, which was a very direct, you know, oh my God, how do we have kids? How does this even function? How is this a process that, being as psychologically analytical as I was at the time, Possessions was a song that tried to quantify that, unsuccessfully, I think. But it was very direct in that sense. But with Synchestra, there's songs like Baby Song, and there's, you know, a lot of allusions to things that were going on during the strapping period that I think, looking back in time, when I think about Synchestra, it's very clear to me that this was an audio testament to me saying, okay, enough of this. I've got to find a way to move on from this particular mindset. And it wasn't until I got through The New Black, which we'll get to as well, that I was able to move on from strapping. I've got this annoying tendency of needing to finish things that I've committed to, specifically if there was a real concrete agenda. For example, with Strapping on Lead, I had signed a 5-record deal, and it was very important for me not to just bail on it, even though after Alien I knew full well in my mind that I was done with that. I immediately started writing for the New Black, just because I thought, okay, well, the fastest way out of this is through. So the sooner I can kind of finish those contractual obligations, the sooner I can say not only am I moving on to another phase, but I did what I said I was going to do. And I think it's the same with the podcasts to a certain extent. My intention from the beginning was to go through all the records, or at least the significant ones. And by doing that, by the time it gets to Empath, it is at least, in my mind, clear that the trajectory for what I've done is not random. It's based on a lot of things that, regrettably, I didn't have the emotional maturity when I was younger to articulate to the people that were going through it with me. But c'est la vie in that sense. So Synchestra was a very definite mission statement about what was going to happen next. Even when you look at the song's triumph, you know, calling, it's calling, I can't stay here, knowing there's no higher. You know, the whole thing about that album was very much like, how do I make something that makes me feel good? Ending with the song Sunshine and Happiness, which, if you take a song like that, Sunshine and Happiness, and then put it side by side Shitstorm, which was released at approximately the same time, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was two different people. But I think the main thing that I've always tried to adhere to when I was writing, no matter what it is, and no matter what it continues to be, is to commit. So if by searching through my motivations I find that the music wants to go in a certain direction, and I'm compelled to take it that direction, it's often because there's something that I feel I need to learn through that compulsion. But the only way that I find it becomes accurate is if I commit to it completely. So a song like Sunshine and Happiness is this bippy kind of, you know, pop rock, up-tempo, major harmony kind of thing. And Shitstorm is this claustrophobic, very dark, just panic attack put to metal, basically. But on both sides, it was important for me to commit to them. When I was doing Alien, as I'd mentioned in the last episode, I had stumbled across a technique with Ableton Live that was very exciting to me at the time. And still to this day, it's important for me to have some sort of, for lack of a better word, gimmick that I can wrap my head around for a record. As an example, the gospel choir in Epic Cloud, the orchestra on Deconstruction, the women's choir, and the 3 drummers for Empath, and for Alien and Synchestra. The thing that was really sort of turning my handle at that point was this technique that I had sort of discovered, I guess, with Ableton Live. And to describe that, the last one I had mentioned, that the beginning of Zen off of Alien was written with that technique, where I would take an existing song and I would bring it in to Ableton Live. And for those of you who are familiar with the program, you know it's a very highly customizable platform. And I would take a submix of the song I was working on, just, you know, bass, drums, guitar, whatever state it was in, And I would import that from Pro Tools, which is my main editing platform. And I would line it up in Ableton so it was on the same tempo. And then I would take sections and loop it. And with that loop, I would then import random pieces of audio from other bands or voices or my own instrumentation. And then I would set it so that the pieces of audio that got imported would be automatically cut so the transients lined up to the tempo. And then I would just take those transient markers in the clip view and just move them and then pitch them and add effects to them. So it became this really interesting, in my mind, warped sort of background sound. And in the case of Alien, it was very, like, it sounded like insects to me. But in Synchestra, where I used it, and I used it throughout, but notably in the song Notes from Africa, in the background of the song, there was this looping pattern that was done in the same way. And I just found that very appealing at that point. But what tends to happen is once I'm finished a segment of my career or a particular period of time, then I just lose interest in that. So I don't think I used that effect after that. And in Notes from Africa, there's another song to sort of dig into to a certain extent. That was a song that I had written during the Infinity period. I remember driving up through Burnaby and the dun 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 dun. Those sorts of colliding melodies and rhythms became a loop that I sort of compartmentalized in my mind, thinking, okay, this doesn't work for Infinity, but eventually this will have a place. And to be fair, there's ideas that I've had for going on 30 years now that are still kind of rolling around in my head and waiting for a peg to be hung on. And Notes from Africa was one of those. But if you listen to Synchestra, throughout it are like birds and nature sounds. And I consciously, during the writing of this, went out of my way to make something jubilant, something really, really positive. And I did that not only to try and counteract for myself the effects of what I felt I was having to contend with as a result of diving so deep into the Alien project, but also for the sake of the audience, because I was aware at this point that the audience was splitting into two camps. But there was also a segment of the audience that participated with both. And I remember hearing that a friend of mine, upon listening to Info Dump, the last song on Alien, he was listening to it in his car and he broke down and it made him cry. And I remember thinking, wow, this guy doesn't necessarily go in that direction that often. So there's a power there that I need to be aware of. I remember Dave Brocky as well, singer from Gwar, who's unfortunately passed. I remember when he first started listening to the work that I did with Strapping, and some friends of mine in other bands as well, they said, well, it's metal, but there's this unrelenting sort of horror underneath it that sort of just is very unnerving. And by design, I would have to say. And I remember thinking, if you've gone out of your way to make that statement with Alien, that you clearly felt the need to make, and it has clearly put you personally in a frame of mind which is so unsettling, then it's important for me to make something immediately that, gosh, I don't know, it's like drinking a lassi after a spicy Indian meal, where it's your tongue's on fire, but you sort of drink this to calm it down somewhat. And in fact, at the same time as Synchestra, I was working on the Hummer, which even more so was meant to calm people and me. But going back to the audience itself, now it's commonplace for me in my work to be aware of the fact that there is a certain faction of people who listen to what I do that only have interest in certain things, like the brutal stuff or the really, really heavy stuff. And not only have no interest in the other things like Ghost or Casualties or Synchestra or what have you, but are aggressively against it. And I've always kind of been of the mindset that I want people to enjoy this. And if not enjoy it directly, I want people to appreciate what its intention was. And ultimately, how all those intentions sort of coalesce into a career arc, hence these podcasts again. And I remember talking to a super fan, if we want to look at it that way, of strapping, right towards the end of the Alien process. And I remember he had heard it, and he said, I need to know what these lyrics are about. And when I explained it to him, he was confused. And then when I said, hey, have you heard the Synchestra album? He immediately was like, no, I have no interest in that. I have no interest in anything other than that you do. This particular faction of your creative identity is the only thing that appeals to me. And that was, with Synchestra, it was the first time that became like a definite separation. Because up to that point, Ocean Machine and City, they were clearly very different from each other. But the audience was much smaller, so it was more acceptable to be able to participate in both. This actually even brings me to this green screen concert that is happening on Saturday. I mean, I've put a ton of energy and resource and effort into making this green screen show that I do for Saturday as good as it can be. I mean, considering the limitations, of course, with COVID and proximity and all this. But I started thinking about it the other day because some people who were close to me said, well, how does it feel for you to participate in some of the strapping stuff that you're doing for this green screen show? And I was sort of taken back by my feelings towards that question because my answer was, oh, I feel fine. And I thought, well, you've had such a hang up about it for so long. What has changed? And I think a couple of things has changed. First off, I chose to do it independent of anybody who had participated in the music in the past. I think that the idea of being in any of my prior bands again is something that would be wrong for me. And so that definitely sort of separates it from the past because it is a different thing. But also, and more importantly, I feel that after Empath and after the pandemic and after all these things and all these changes that have happened over the past 6 months, over the past few years, Empath took a while to kind of gestate and all that. I feel that I'm on the verge of doing something very different again. And change is something that is polarizing, specifically to an audience, because a lot of times people rely on certain sounds or certain musicians or artists to provide something that, frankly, give people comfort. It's like a sound that you can relate to. It's that again. It's in a sea of chaos, at least we hear this band and it sounds like that band. And to change oftentimes is something that people just don't have a lot of interest in. But I mean, as an artist, I'll say it again, without change, there's no progress. And if my intention is to progress, which it very clearly is, as a person, more so than an artist, I'm sure, as a person, then the changes that seem to come and all these gimmicks, like I'd mentioned earlier about Ableton or the choirs or whatever, that seem to sort of captivate me for a time, that becomes a way for me to sort of step from place to place. And so this green screen concert is almost like, before I move on, before I go to this next thing, whatever that is, but I do feel it's going to be very different. It's almost like I feel like there's a different life coming up for me in somehow. I don't know. It's hard to describe. But before that, I want to participate in that stuff in a way that not only honors it, but also accepts it. Because I think it's typical for me to interpret other people's reactions in accordance to what they hear in my work and their interpretation of me based on what they hear in it. It's typical for me to internalize that and think, well, because this person took this energy from that piece of music, clearly there's something wrong with me. But over the past few years, it's become increasingly more apparent to me that that's their trip. And Strapping, Ocean Machine, Infinity, Synchestra, all these records, they're just different facets of the same person, the same personality. And so to not honor that at this point, and to not do it with as much care and as much attention as I can possibly muster, seems disrespectful, not to the audience necessarily, but to myself and what it is that I'm trying to do. So I've put a ton of effort into trying to make this green screen show as good as it can be. And it's the by request set. So, there's a lot of strapping, there's a lot of DTP, there's a lot of DTB. And I think it sounds fantastic. But I also realize by doing it that I'm not interested in a lot of this stuff anymore. And Synchestra is where that started. And had I not sort of blown my mind, I guess, with Alien, had I not felt it was important to my creative growth to follow that to the nth degree, it wouldn't have traumatized me enough to let it go. And I guess that was the lesson of this period. That's what I needed to learn. A lot of times I feel, these lessons keep coming back to us, but we're maybe not ready to hear them. And I think it took that whole period for me to be like, wow, okay, this is going to end poorly. This is going to end with me. Well, who knows where it would have ended for me, but I felt during Alien that it could have ended in a place that was terrible, suicidal. And I think that perhaps during the Infinity period, there was that sort of sense, that sort of martyr syndrome, that sort of Christ complex thing that seemed romantic for someone's work to send them over the hill like that. But I felt I had been privy to enough emotional experiences during the course of all these albums that I couldn't, in all consciousness, allow that to happen and not feel like I was just being dramatic. So it really became this mission for me in some ways to get myself out of that frame of mind, to get myself out of that reoccurring cycle, after Infinity, where I ended up in the psychiatric hospital and I had gone down all these avenues, and then I was aware of the ego, and I was aware of all these things that were drawing me back into the orbit of this work. And I think that if I had allowed myself to perpetuate that sort of martyrish frame of mind, I think that if something had happened where I had accidentally or otherwise taken myself out, I think it would have been with the awareness that I was full of shit. And it took a lot of effort to say, okay, well, we're not going to allow this. I'm not going to allow myself to be a casualty of this very obvious sort of selfish motivation. So, Let It Roll, Hypergeek, Triumph, Baby Song, Vampira, and Vampoka. Those were almost alluding to what was going to happen with Ziltoid. As I'll discuss when I get to the Ziltoid stuff, what that particular period of my work ended up being rooted in was trying to, once I had gotten away from strapping, stand back and say, okay, well, let's take stock of this. Let's look at this and let's see how this happened. Let's see how this kid that started in the way that you did when you were a teen ended up making this. How did this happen? And I think because for many years I was afraid to look at it, Ziltoid became a convenient way for me to objectify that energy and realize that a lot of it was rooted in sort of repressed adolescence. And so Ziltoid, of course, was this omnidimensional, all-powerful alien entity who is just stunted. You know, he's just scatological humor. He's just a big kid that's got some sort of power. And I think Vampira was the first time that I was sort of dipping my toes into how do I look back at this and try and make sense of how this happened? How do I look back at this career and go from, you know, a 15-year-old kid listening to Enya to a 28-year-old man singing Shitstorm? Like, how did that happen? That was never part of the plan. I mean, I remember when I was younger knowing people that were really into Slayer and Venom and all these bands, and it didn't not interest me, but it was just not my thing, really. I liked Metallica. I thought it was cool. I liked Judas Priest. I liked some of the heavy metal stuff. Of course, I was, in the 80s. But the real brutal, intense stuff, I remember the first time I heard Morbid Angel, and this is a band that now I love listening to Morbid Angel. I thought they were great. But I remember when I first heard them, I heard them through Jed. And I remember thinking, I don't get this at all. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense why this exists. And so, again, Vampira was this way for me to take that energy that I was clearly participating in and say, okay, well, how can I look at this in a way that is not giving it so much energy that I'm just afraid of myself? So all the lyrics, if you go through Synchestra and you listen to the lyrics on this album, it's very clear to me that this was a direct reflection on the Alien album. Mental Tan, there's another song. There was a group of friends that I was with during this period, and we had this book, I think it was called What Color Is Your Aura? It's just one of these things. A friend of ours had this book, and I think everybody was sitting around or having drinks or something, and it's a series of several hundred questions that are very specific. I seem to remember that one of the questions was something similar to, when you hold an object, do you gauge its value by how substantial it feels? And out of interest, yes, very much for me. So it was questions like that seem on the surface very vague, but after answering them, it puts you into these categories, and the categories were colors. And I remember thinking at the time, well, clearly I'm going to answer these questions and I'm going to be, the highest of the high. I think it was crystal or something, where you were basically, hyper aware, and I don't know what the description of that particular personality type was, but suffice to say, it was flattering to be that. And so when all the numbers were tallied up and we were all doing this test, there's maybe 5 or 6 of us, I was convinced that was going to be the one. But then when it came out, mine ended up that I was brown. And I remember thinking, excuse me? And the description was like, well, if you were an animal, you would be a cow. If you were a food, you would be a brown bean. And I remember thinking, well, that doesn't fit into my self-image at all. I thought that on some level I was this effervescent, celestial entity. And hearing that by answering as honestly as I could, my analysis was that you're very basic, super basic, more than basic. I remember thinking like, oh, what a bummer. There must be something wrong with that book. Shake it. But that was one of those moments that, regardless of whether or not one subscribes to any of that stuff, which, who knows? It actually helped me, that little test, because it was humbling for me to not only be right or wrong, be attributed to something very basic when I was answering questions honestly. It helped me because I think it alleviates a lot of mental pressure for us to accept who we are, to truly accept who we are. I think, and I've said this before, I think we run into situations in life where we construct an image of ourselves that we want other people to believe. And as an artist or as a creator, with all the tools at our disposal, with Photoshop and Auto-Tune and Pro Tools and, all these things, and time, you're able to sort of construct an identity for yourself that's a collage of all these things that you like, and then present it to people as if that is who you are. And I think a lot of times people can get caught in that when they've meticulously constructed an identity for themselves, and then they're caught being incongruent with that identity. They're caught essentially being exactly who they are. I think a lot of times, some of us are more sensitive to this than others, but oftentimes, and I've been wrong before, I can tell when what somebody is saying to me is different than what they are. I've been with people in the past who tell me exactly what I want to hear, and they sell themselves in a way that seems like exactly what people would want. Like this person is together and organized and enlightened or what have you. But then you see in their eyes, perhaps, or you see in their actions, more so than their eyes, I guess, but in their actions, you're like, well, that doesn't line up with this ideology that you are promoting, with this image that you're selling of yourself, what you're doing here is in opposition to that. And my reaction to that is I can't trust them because I think I don't believe what you're saying. So for me, being analyzed by friends, granted, but by answering honestly this dumb book, my analysis was that you're really simple, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you will find what it is that you're looking for. Now, when I say simple, I don't necessarily mean in terms of thought process or complexity of what we're writing or any of those things. I mean, clearly for myself, I overthink and have tended to overthink and have written some absurdly complicated stuff over the years. So I don't think I'm a simple thinker, but more so I think that my nature is, I find myself very attracted to things that are uncomplicated. And I think up to this point, or up to that point at least, I had deluded myself into thinking that it was something different than that. So Mental Tan, that little instrumental, there's a backstory on how that came out, because I think that was the diagnosis, if you want to call it that, at that point. Songs like Gaia, Pixelate, all these songs have a sense of optimism to them, specifically in the lyrics, you know. We're the rainbow, you know, you are the sun to my chameleon. Gaia is clearly about the earth. Judgement was an interesting song for me as well. I think like a lot of us in North America, I was raised with this sense of sort of Western religion. You know, you go to Sunday school or you go to church and there's this fear. There's this fear of what you're taught is God. And always it seems like that fear was rooted in people wanting to believe, not necessarily because they subscribe to it, but just because they don't want to be punished. I've always felt that if your connection to the infinite or God is based in just wanting to go to quote-unquote heaven, then I don't think you're really participating in anything beyond you. I think that you're more of a fear-based reaction to these things. But that's how I was raised, and it took me many years to begin to feel that any idea of the infinite or God is within us, all of us, rather than an external patriarchal force. But I think because Alien had gone so far in that direction, at that particular point in my life, I felt like, oh, I have sinned. I think that between Alien and Infinity, and as I alluded to in the Infinity podcast, there was a bunch of things that I had participated in during the Infinity era that went against everything that I had been taught as a kid. And it took Synchestra as well, after it was over, and talking to another friend who was significantly older than me, for him to say, well, you need to get over this. And the only way you're going to be able to be of any service to other people is if you forgive yourself for these things first. And all the time in the world spent flagellating oneself based on what you feel you did or didn't do, or people you hurt, or anything. It's important to recognize the ways that you have done these or made these mistakes. But from that point, it's about making sure that you understand the ways that you have gone wrong in your mind. And then if it's caused you the problems that are as upsetting as they can be, then it's about vowing not to do that again. More so than spending the rest of your life beating yourself up over it. And I think Judgement as a song, I had taken this, there's in the beginning of the song, there's this really long intro. And far in the background, and there's a lot of sort of ear candy on Synchestra, but far in the background was this group prayer that was going on. And the idea is that you are before the judgment. All your life, all your transgressions are laid out. And how do you atone for these things? How do you forgive yourself for these things? And I think it was just so much of a part of my emotional turmoil at that point, feeling like, oh, I've done the wrong thing. I've done the wrong thing for me. And again, as I said earlier, even in this podcast, I didn't have the emotional maturity back then to be able to express that to the people that were around me. So for bandmates or what have you, there was a significant amount of confusion based on me trying to work this out. A Simple Lullaby. Oh, A Simple Lullaby is the one with the long intro and the prayer, I'm sorry. Judgement is the one that starts first. I know you're on a never-ending plane. That song, yeah. And A Simple Lullaby is almost like where I was able to creatively accept that type of thinking is going to result in me not progressing. The type of thinking that just goes into, I'm a bad person, is not going to help me get out of that. It's not going to help me progress. It's just going to result in music, art, and a lifestyle that is rooted in, well, on some level, for me at least, feeling sorry for myself. It didn't feel like that at the time. It felt very legitimate. It felt like, since physicist, it was just, I'm sorry. But what was so interesting is after physicist, I was like, I'm so sorry, I won't do this again. And then I did it again, with SYL. And then Alien, I'm so sorry, I wouldn't do it again. I'm so sorry. It's like it was a pattern. Judgement and A Simple Lullaby was another example of that pattern. But the difference being is I think that by the time I got to Synchestra, although I was aware that the process of moving forward from this point was going to be complicated and was going to be long. Even to get where I am now, I had an eye on that at the time. I remember even back in the physicist day having a photo of myself up in my studio that looked like that's where you want to be. I was happy. But I had to go through this. And I think, although I'm bouncing around from topic to topic here, it will probably come as no surprise to anybody. Back at this point when I was almost satirical trying to understand the energy with Vampira or Ziltoid. It was a way for me to understand what had happened, I suppose. And it wasn't until Empath that I was able to re-participate in that stuff without irony, without satire, and just be a little bit more like, okay, well, as opposed to me being afraid of this, it's about looking at it. It's about trying to find ways to integrate it so that moving forward I can make decisions as to whether or not this is appropriate for me at all. Sunset this album on Synchestra. Sunset was written in, I think it must have been New Mexico. We were on tour during Ozfest. Was it during Ozfest? No, it was before that. But we were on tour, one of the endless tours that we were on at that time. And I remember being in a hotel room at the end of the day, and the sun was going down in the desert, and I remember thinking, okay, there's a lot of work to be done here. You're aware of that. It's not a secret to you that in order for you to make this step, which you seem committed to taking, it's not going to be effortless. But that day with the sunset seemed to be significant to me because it was almost a metaphor for how this was playing out. And again, Notes from Africa was a song written years ago that finally found its place and fit into this album. There's a long section between Notes from Africa and Sunshine and Happiness. That's just the sound of birds and nature. And Mike Young, the bass player for Devin Townsend Band, I asked him if he would take a tape recorder and go to the, what is it called? The indoor gardens, the indoor jungle. It was the Blodell Conservatory in Vancouver. And in fact, after he had gotten those sounds, I'd grown up loving that place so much that we did the photos there as well. And I called them, and you can rent the whole conservatory for $100, basically. You just have to come in an hour before they open the doors. So we did the photos there. And I think that leads me to the personnel on the record as well. So I had put together for the first Devin Townsend Band project, Accelerated Evolution, the group of people, same group of people that played on Synchestra. So again, it was Ryan Van Poederoyen on drums, Mike and Dave Young, bass and keyboards, and Brian Waddell, Beeve, on guitar this time. And I remembered during the first recordings that we had done, I had wanted those groups of people, or that group of people, to do on Accelerated Evolution something that I had been searching for with Ocean Machine. I wanted them all to play this sort of mid-tempo, heavy-hitting, simple sort of music, which in a lot of ways is what Accelerated Evolution ended up being. But I believe that in hindsight, I was not necessarily paying attention to what type of players they actually were. And all of those guys, maybe save Brian, were very interested in complicated music. They were interested in Dream Theater and, very challenging technical things to play. And Mike was an accomplished fingerstyle bass player, and all I wanted him to do on Accelerated Evolution is just, play open C notes, quarter notes. And although they did it, I always got the impression that they were aching to do something more. So I thought that when it came time for me to write this, I would also keep in mind the fact that challenging them on the instrumentation part of it would be something that would be very interesting to them. And Synchestra was written very quickly and almost as a stream of conscience. Let It Roll, Hyper Geek, Triumph, Baby Song, for example, that is essentially one long piece of music. And I kept pushing them, so we'd go to the studio, and as opposed to the last time where I was telling the bassist, hey, just sit back, just play something chill, like just, hammer home those quarter notes. This time, it would be more like, okay, follow that guitar line, follow that keyboard line. Do you hear what the drums are doing there? Follow that. Do it with a slap. Anything. And that became something that was engaging for those guys. And they all did great. And I think that I will always remember one particular moment, because we were recording in my basement. And Beeve, has been my friend for years, remains so. And when we were kids together, all he wanted to listen to was Kiss. That's what he wanted to hear. And so for me, saying, well, I insist that you play guitar. I'll play the guitar on one side of the spectrum and you play the guitar on the other, because when we do it live, I want you to know the parts. And that's something that I've typically done. If I really want people to participate in the music, I'll ask them to record it. That way they have a real tangible experience with what it is I'm looking for. Even when we looked at the green screen again that we're doing on Saturday, I got Wes and Liam and Samus to learn this stuff and record it, when it would have been easier in some sense for me just to do it myself. And I remember with Beeve being in the basement of my house, and he had to work all day, and he would come over right after work, and I went upstairs to grab some water or something, and I came back down and he had fallen asleep on his guitar. And just the amount of information that I was trying to get him to absorb. Considering this is the same friend of mine that was listening to I Want to Rock and Roll All Night. And not that I dislike what Kiss was, but in comparison to what the other guys in the band were listening to, which was very much about technique, it really pushed Brian in ways that maybe he benefited from, but I know really made him tired. So thanks, Beeve. And we went through, and it was a real laborious recording, but it was also the first time, as I'd said earlier, that I had an opportunity to do it myself. So a couple of things happened in order for me to facilitate that. First off, I bought a laptop and a small I/O unit, like a Tascam 2-channel in, 2-channel out. And for the first time, I was able to kind of set up my own studios. And by that, I mean we could go to someone's house and I could set up a little station on the kitchen table, or we could go into a garden and I could set up in the corner and mic it up, or we could do tuba in somebody's garage or whatever it was. And I found that really liberating. And as a backstory to my production and engineering techniques, I never learned how to do it correctly. Although I guess technically I did mix Punky Brewster, and technically I did mix Infinity. They were the equivalent of a demo, I guess. I hadn't learned any techniques at that point. I just kind of put microphones in front of things and then turned the EQ knobs until it didn't irritate me as much. But all the records after that, and the experiences that I had with Daniel Bergstrand or Mike Plotnikoff or Mike Fraser or Sean Thingvold or any of these engineers and producers that I had worked with, you just start to pick up techniques. And you start saying, oh, that's how you do this. Oh, that's how you edit the guitars. Oh, that's how you make the spaces between the notes clean. Oh, that's how you do a crossfade. Oh, that's the hotkey for Beat Detective, or any of these technical things. You just start to learn them, because as much as all these other records were quote unquote mixed by other people, I was in the room for all of it. The relative levels, and by that I mean how loud the bass is compared to the kick, or how loud the keyboard is compared to the cymbals. These are things that I intuitively understand, because my vision for what these songs are have a very clear motivation behind them and a sonic fingerprint that I'm trying to encapsulate. So I was there for all of those recordings. But not having gone to school for engineering, not having produced bands, not having mixed things in a real way, I was very much, I felt, at the mercy of other people. And although I didn't know how to achieve it, I have always had a very distinct idea of what I want things to sound like. Every aspect of it. I've got a very distinct idea of what I want the kick to sound like for a certain song, or the guitars, or the overall frequency range, or the compression. All these things. And as much as I've done a lot of work and I'm clearly getting better at this, I'm still nowhere near what I hope to be able to achieve in the future. The learning never stops. But Synchestra was the first time where I took the reins. And I remember some engineers that I had worked with during this period. I remember feeling, well, frankly insulted by them. Because there's a overarching sense with a certain faction of the audio community that it's not right unless it's technically accurate. And I think that same faction of the audio community was very intimidating to me as well. Because I always knew how I wanted things to feel. And working with Daniel Bergstrand was great because we were able to not only have it technically right for the time, but I was also able to say, okay, now it's technically right. That's not loud enough, not enough echo on that. Bass is too much clack on the kick drum. The keyboards in relationship to the guitars, keyboards need to be louder. Too much compression on the bus, any of those things. I was able to be there for that. So as much as he was the hands-on technical guy, I was able to really guide that ship. So by the time Ocean Machine and City were finished, they felt right. And I think not having the opportunity to work with Daniel after that, more based on proximity, you know, he's on the other side of the planet and budgets were low, all these sorts of things. I had to find people around Vancouver to work with, and no one had the same ear as Daniel. So even in the beginning, I was very aware that a lot of the sounds that I was getting with these people that I was working with in Vancouver, although perhaps technically correct, were not to my liking. Terry got a little closer because I was able to be in the room with the engineer for that one. But a lot of the other ones, they just didn't like the kick. I didn't like the kick. I didn't like the amount of compression that was being used. I didn't like the frequency that we were focused on in the guitars. And I felt at times that there was that scene of engineers that I guess I felt were condescending towards people who didn't know what they were doing. So I remember saying, hey, this isn't right. And the reaction would be, well, you don't know that it is right. And I'm like, well, I think I do, actually. I do know that it's wrong. And I remember one engineer, a real good friend of mine, actually, who got very upset while we were doing the Alien record because I had plugged in 2 different colored cables to run my interface, and maybe 2 different brands. And he was like, I hate it when people do that. That's not the correct way to do it. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, but when I hear what you're doing, albeit correct in your mind, it doesn't feel right to me. And so it became a point of contention for me because I kept looking for people that would sort of recreate that experience that I'd had with Daniel, where I didn't have to think about the technical aspects of it. I didn't have to think about the compression on the kick and the, you know, whether or not the bus compressor was hitting too hard for the tempo, or whether or not the snare was in tune for this. You know what I mean? It's like that was something that I had to be way more aware of when I was back in Vancouver, to the point where I started feeling like I knew what I wanted And the effort that went into trying to explain myself and rationalize to people what I wanted, not having the background of being able to express that in a technical language, was becoming very frustrating to me. And not only frustrating, but expensive. You're paying people to do the job, and at the end of it, I was always there saying, hey, let's bring back this, let's do this, let's try this. And it became an arm wrestle that as Synchestra started coming together, I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to start mixing. And I realized even at the time that the only way that I was going to become a technically proficient mixer is to just do it. And I remember when Synchestra came out, a lot of the reviews were saying, oh, it doesn't sound good. It's too much high end. The drums aren't punchy enough. And I agree, 100%. However, I remember there was a studio that I was working with, and they had a guy that was the owner there who was a very musical cat, very musically astute cat. And I remember bringing the mixes in from certain projects that I was doing. And I brought in Synchestra, and I brought in another one that a more high-profile mixing engineer, who incidentally wouldn't let me in the room while he was mixing, had done. And I remember showing it to this guy, and he was the first guy that gave me a vote of confidence. He said, well, you know what? Yes, maybe your kick and snare don't have that classic compression. Maybe your frequencies are a little wonky here and there. Maybe there's too much high end, for sure. But your relative levels, your ability to balance what it is that you're looking for, is really, really on point. And given time, all these other techniques, all these other technical skills that seem to be so sought after in that community can be learned. But the thing that can't be learned, to the same degree at least, is listening and the feel for this complicated music. And I remember when Synchestra came out and people were critical of the way it sounded, I remember thinking, okay, well, that stings because I've put a lot of effort into it. However, the only way that it's going to get better, and I would suggest this to any of you who are creators as well, if you're not able to achieve what it is that you're after, you just have to start doing it. And you have to understand, in my opinion, that one of the finest motivators for self-improvement is failure. And specifically public failure. People have often asked me, do you have one piece of advice you could give to musicians starting out in the formative stages? Like, what would be one thing that you would suggest to them? And I've said this over and over, and if you have followed what I've done, you've probably heard me say this, but that is, learn to fail efficiently. Learn that there's a good chance that if it's your own record and you've invested this much blood, sweat, and tears into it, you're not going to be phoning in this mix. It's not going to sound bad because you tried to make it sound bad. It's going to sound that way because you're new to it. But anybody who has had success in any field have had to fail and start again, fail, start again, fail, start again, fail, start again. And Synchestra, even going into it, I knew that I have to mix this, so every concurrent album that I do, I'll be able to learn from these mistakes. But a lot of times I have to admit it's the equivalent of learning how to walk in the middle of a marathon. Even now, even today, I'm learning about frequency ranges for where the kick drum should sit and where the bass sits according to the tempo in relationship to the frequency of the kick, and the upper mid-range frequencies in which my voice exists at the same frequency as the orchestra and the cymbals and the mid-range of distorted guitars, and how do you make that work? And it's always going to be a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge. And it's interesting because I have had a lot of people, engineers, that are essentially saying to me, well, let me mix your stuff. And I say, well, to be honest, I don't say it as often as I used to. I only say it to people whom I know and care for now. It's not going to work. It's challenging material. It's recorded in a very strange way. And the vision that I have for it is so specific that what constitutes a normal, technically proficient mix oftentimes doesn't make this music feel like it needs to feel. Anytime I've mixed with somebody else, the first iteration of the mix that comes back from them, it's all drums, bass, guitar, and vocal. And then all the ear candy and all the orchestration and overdub guitars and echoes and all these things are hidden as if they were special effects. But my technique for recording is, in my opinion, much more in line with an orchestral sort of arrangement, where EQ and compression is not a huge component to why it works. It's all relative levels. So fortunately, I've gotten to the point now where I can understand by listening to it, hey, there's too much low mids in that kick drum, and that's getting in the way of the tuba or what have you. But I would have never been able to get to that point had I not started with Synchestra. So it was on a PC. I've been on Mac for years now for no particular reason other than that's kind of the scene that I fell into, I suppose. But at that time, what I could afford was a PC with Nuendo. And I used a cracked version of that and recorded all the Synchestra with this very, very modest system. And although I had been in the presence of all these great engineers who were technically very adept, I thought that I had absorbed more of it than I did. So when it came time to try and put this together, I recognized that much of my work at this point was just shooting in the dark. So the EQ curves, the drums, the cymbals, I had a lot of the techniques down. Like I was replacing the kicks with samples, and I was cutting all the sounds between the toms, and I was gating the guitars properly, but I had no idea how to actually make a mix work other than these relative levels. So everything had way too much EQ on it. I wanted it to sound like those big records that I was interested in. So as opposed to recognizing how much of this is a balancing act between the mix and the mastering, I was doing it all whilst recording. So I would record things with tons of high end and tons of low end. And if it was a bass, I would track it hyper compressed. And then when it came time to mix, if it was too compressed, there's no place for me to go. And I remember when we were finally assembling the mix, what I thought would be a clever idea, and I realized again while doing it why more people don't do it, was I would mix it at home. I would mix it on my computer, and then I would take it to a studio, and then I would separate all the tracks so they were coming out individual outputs. And then, in my mind, all I would have to do was put all the faders at 0, like on the board, and it would sound like the mix that I liked. But what I also hadn't learned, and what I also hadn't taken into consideration, is that the rooms that I had recorded this in, like buddies' basements and garages and living rooms and kitchens and all these things where I had these little Advent speakers set up, were so inconsistent in terms of my ability to gauge what I was actually listening to through the speakers, that when I finally put it up into a professional studio, all the sounds that I thought were balanced were completely out of whack. I was like, what happened to the bass? What happened to that keyboard? What happened to that vocal? Why is there so much low mid? Why is there so much this, that, and the other thing? And then my plan, which was to invest in 2 days of recording, ended up being 2 days of just frantic, all-night endeavors trying to solve these crazy sounds that up to that point I had not heard. So by the time Synchestra was finished, those 2 days of mix, I remember listening to it and thinking, wow, this doesn't sound anywhere near as good as most of these records that I've done. What do I do now? It's got this very small, sort of harsh, high-endy, without any push. How do I solve this? So Greg really, I had master it, but again, he didn't have a lot to work with. It was already so much equalization information on those finished tracks that there's not a lot of places he could go. He had done a great job mastering Infinity, but more so because the quality of the Infinity mixes were just so poor to begin with that there was nowhere for them to go but up during that process. But with Synchestra, the mixes were just so aggressively equalized and compressed that when he went to master it, it was, how do you basically just tame this? So at that point, I went on a tour, and I think the tour, it wasn't Ozfest like I had thought earlier. It was a tour called Sounds of the Underground. And we were out with Strapping, and we were touring in preparation for the Alien record. And while we were on tour, I remember, as a side note, it was funny as well because, the band and the tour and the crew, I was just so bent out of shape by everything that I had done with the Alien record that I commandeered the back lounge and I had it set up with nothing but sitar music. So I would get off stage and immediately be listening to this super chill sort of yoga type music. And I didn't want to be doing it. Even the intro tape that we had for Strapping was just yoga music that ended up devolving into chaos. But while we were on tour with that, I would go back into that room and I would work on finishing the mastering for Synchestra. Because although I had those 2 days to mix it, I couldn't let it go. By the time I was finished the mix, I remember listening to it and thinking, oh, this is an amateur sounding production. So what I did was I had my little 2-track Tascam interface and I had it set up in the back lounge and I kept adding ear candy to it with the built-in microphone on my computer. If you listen to the beginning of Triumph, where it's just holding that F chord and it's like tuka, in the background there, you'll hear all these sort of echoey sounds, and that was actually me just trying to make ambience by speaking and making noises into my computer laptop. Then I would send that to Greg, and he would integrate it into the mix, but I would have to send it by CD at that time. It was, although reasonably recent, it was a different world in terms of the recordings. I also remember during that Sounds of the Underground tour, which was good. As a band, Strapping was on fire during that tour, and it was such a great lineup of bands. It was ourselves, I forget who else was on it, Opeth and Lamb of God and Chimera and Guar and Unearth, and I think it was a really good social situation. So as much as I was kind of bent out of shape about the whole Alien thing, it was at least a nice summer. And so I would go into the back lounge there and try and work on these songs and work on the mastering. And during that time in the back lounge is when I started both Devlab and the Hummer. So as a bit of a sideline here, let me just do a quick overview on those two records because they also occurred during this period. The Hummer existed as, in my mind, I wanted to make an album of calming, low frequencies that, when turned up enough, would vibrate the room in ways that felt healing. So I had a Nord synthesizer, and what I would do is I would actually take a piece of gaff tape and I would find the note with a low frequency, like a bass sound, that would vibrate the room in a certain way. And I realized that certain notes vibrated certain things differently in my room. So I would hold, let's just say for sake of argument, a D, and my cabinet would vibrate. And then I'd move it to an E or whatever, and then the CDs would vibrate. And it made me start thinking that everything reacts to these frequencies differently. And why was it that when I held these frequencies, as oppressive as the sound was, did it make me feel like it was neutralizing some of this chaotic energy that was within me? So I would take a piece of gaff tape and just hold the note down and then wander around the room looking for where and what was resonating. And I started to view the Hummer as a very important piece of work for me. And I spent almost a year picking away at that album. And the thing about the Hummer as well is I never wanted it to be a commercial release. I never wanted it to be on Spotify. I never wanted it to be have a UPC code. And I've been successful to a certain extent in keeping it personal. And the reason why I wanted it to be that way is that one was very much for me. At that point, I hadn't learned to meditate. I was still trying to achieve these things synthetically. And I think the Hummer was another example of trying to do that, trying to achieve that. And as a side note, I remember an associate of mine who was much more in the strapping young lad side of my work, had no interest in the other side of it. I remember when he heard the Hummer, I remember his reaction was curious to me, because my thought was, when you turn it up, this is a wonderful experience. It's like warm and vibrating, and I love it. But he was like, you need to turn that off, because to me that sounds like a weapon. And I remember thinking, wow, that's an interesting assessment of that. Since that time, I view Hummer a little differently, and I'll discuss that in a second. But before that, I'll say that congruent with the Hummer, I was doing another record called Devlab. Both the Hummer and the Devlab record were being worked on while I was doing the mastering in the back lounge for Synchestra. And again, Hummer and Devlab act as records that are connected but opposite. And I remember, again, a friend of mine who was very much in the DTP side of my work, who heard Devlab, and he had to leave the room. He says, I hate that. I hate that. And I remember thinking, wow, it's curious, because both of these things make sense to me. So what Devlab ultimately was, and Hummer, I guess to a certain extent, is experiments in something that were very different from what I had been doing, but also I was trying to prove a point to myself creatively that the trajectory of the material that I have on all these records can be replicated with noise. What do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes people say, hey, I understand that Casualties of Cool is a concept record, or Ziltoid is a concept record, or Synchestra is a concept record. And what I say in regards to that is, it's a concept only in that if I have some sort of a narrative, then I can fill in the blanks with any number of these pieces of music that I randomly write. So for me, these concepts exist not because I'm trying to make something like Tommy or Operation Mindcrime or something. It's simply, I like to color in a narrative. So I create a story to a certain extent that then I can say, okay, well, in this part of the quote-unquote story, it gets dark, or it gets chaotic, or it gets loving, or it gets happy, or sad, or angry, or psychotic, or whatever. And then it's easy for me to sort of sift through the backlog of material that I constantly write and say, okay, for that part of the narrative, I've got X amount of psychotic songs, or X amount of super mellow songs. And I've always viewed albums and music as almost like an audio movie. You're trying to elicit an emotional reaction so that by the end of the experience, you're kind of guided to a frame of mind that people who are listening can sort of, in a sense, participate in what it was that I felt I was participating in while I was making it. So that narrative becomes super important. But it's the narrative, more so than the story, that's important. And it's that narrative that's also more important than the songs in a lot of ways, because that describes where you were, what was going on, and the songs just fill in the blanks. And for Hummer and Devlab, I tried to establish a narrative, but then fill in the blanks with sound rather than songs. So as you listen through to Devlab, there's distinct sections. And the idea with Devlab was it was supposed to be a dream. So it's like when you have an abstract, lucid dream, when you are participating in that in your sleep, the only thing linear about it is the emotional arc. You know, oh, that's weird. Oh, that's frightening. Oh, that's funny. Oh, that's happy. And I tried to create that with sounds. And how I did that with Devlab is I would just improvise constantly with computers and gear plugged in. I've always liked sound making, ambient making, delays, and, you know, microphones held up to tape recorders, all those sorts of things. That's always been of interest to me. So I would improvise in the same way that I would typically write songs, and I would document them. And I'd put them down as number 1, number 2, number 3, or I would give them names, you know, Reborn as Porn, or whatever the names on that Devlab album were. And then when I finally felt like I had enough content that I could start to make a flow, I was then interested in trying to establish what an abstract dream would feel like, and then what it would be like to not only awaken from it, but to have that specter of what those feelings were. So by the end of Devlab, you know, it all starts to crescendo, and throughout it there's voices and allusions to different things and feelings. But then when the alarm goes off and the guy wakes up with a start, you know, he's like, and you hear those same themes start to sort of float back just for a second before they dissipate. And I've always felt that's what happens during intense dream cycles. You'll wake up with a start, and there'll be this, for, you know, maybe 5 minutes, there'll be this specter of the emotional content of that experience that then leaves. Sometimes there's shadows of it that stay. And I think that's even why at the end of Devlab, it's like, remember, remember. In the beginning, remember, remember. And the Hummer was a similar thing. I tried to make the idea of what it would mean to die and then meet yourself and then participate with your past with a sense of compassion for yourself as opposed to self-pity or anger or disappointment. Just like compassion. Okay, so now you've been through this. Now this sound, being a metaphor for anything, obliterates all that you were. The only thing that's left is your essence. And at that point, you're able to objectively look at this play that has carried out as your life. And not only make peace with it, but recognize that all the things that you've participated in that at the time seemed frightening or difficult or confusing or unfair were ultimately there to help you progress. And I think even going back to the idea of change, that's why these things, I think, are in our lives. I think a lot of times I, at least, psychologically have encouraged certain things, whether or not they're frames of mind or phenomenon or relationships, not based necessarily on wanting to cause myself problems, but maybe there's a psychological awareness that within that relationship, within that circumstance, is something that you don't understand. And by going through it, by participating in it, you're able to come out of it and say, okay, well, in hindsight, without that, I would not have recognized this. I think a lot of, with these podcasts as well, when we've, up to this point, we're on Synchestra now, which is all prior to, the big change that happened in my life with kids and Ziltoid and DTP and all that. Up to this point, there has been so much self-loathing and self-pity and self-absorption that went on in this period that, I'll talk to people who say, you're very self-deprecating when it comes to this stuff. And I would respond to that by saying, well, that's because we're only at this point. And it's been essential for me as a creator to understand that recognition of these things that maybe aren't the most flattering things about my personality, my creative process in my past, is not something that I dwell on as much as just recognize. It's important for me to say, this was a product of that. This particular mindset that you found yourself in has a direct correlation to all these activities that you felt compelled to participate in at the time. And therefore, acknowledging that these past behaviors were this, that, or the other thing is not rooted in self-deprecation for me at this point, but much more, it's healthy to look back and say, there was where the problem lay. And again, I think if you spend much time upon recognizing where these deficiencies in your trip lay, and then just sort of reveling in it, writing more music about it. That's the biggest thing, or making more art about the same thing. I think that's maybe where it's been confusing to some of the audience they think, well, why would you not do these things that people so clearly responded to? And I'll say it again, my objective is not to revel in these things. It's about to recognize them and then move on. And the only way that progress is going to come in my world is by change. So Hummer and Devlab were kind of on the back burner, kind of happening at the same time, but very much a part of this whole period. I sent the final mastering for Synchestra off to Greg Reilly, and I remember getting the record back and being reasonably satisfied with it. This chunk of music came out so quickly, like it was easy to write. So it was a very quick process, but it was also, it also had in it a lot of, conclusions. This was the first album that I participated with Steve Vai again. He played the solo in Triumph. And after years and years away from him, and after years and years of resentment, recognizing how much of that resentment was rooted in my own confusion, and we both grew. When he finally was able to participate again in Triumph, that was the first time that I was able to hear him as the incredible guitar player that he is. Since I was a kid, I remember when I first heard him, I was blown away by his work. But then by working with him, I became resentful, and it was easy for me to not recognize his brilliance. But having him do the solo in Triumph made me remember that. And now, as a side note, with Steve and I having a good relationship, when I hear him play now, I'm just like, wow, there's no one like this guy. He's multiple levels above where most guitar players ever can dream to be. So to have him do a fantastic solo on Triumph was a big thing for me. Baby Song is one of my all-time favorite songs that I've written. And specifically because of the ending, I love the idea that the whole beginning of the song is like a lullaby, essentially, in opposition to Love off of Alien, which was, it's a paradox of needing and make way for breeding and possessions, you want to go to Disneyland, let's have a fucking baby. Like, it was just so pointed at Baby Song was much more like vulnerable. It was like a lullaby, but by the time it gets to the end of the song, I love the chord changes that go on behind that. Do, do, do. Do, 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 do. And then the melody over top of that. Why don't you have a baby? I love the idea that the concept of having children at that point, in hindsight again, was just so strong in me. It was just such a big part of my reality. And I think that heading towards mid-30s, there was really a part of me that started feeling more like, is this all there is? But also there's a part of me that is, as I had said many times, so analytical about things that it was difficult for me to rationalize it in the face of, the world that we live in and all the typical conflicts that someone would express when it comes to having kids. And I think the end of Baby Song, where it modulates to that sort of strange minor while still having that melody, was really an interesting thing for me and one of my favorite moments in the entire catalog. There was also several things about Synchestra that were new and things that I hadn't tried before, and one of which was themes. So, on Terria, during Deep Peace, the guitar solo, does this da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I started bringing that back in Synchestra. And there's a theme that goes on throughout Synchestra that was rooted in that deep peace theme. And I really like the idea that I was able to utilize my clearly rock and roll or heavy metal type proclivities in a way that was also reminiscent of those kind of 70s musicals that had strong themes that would represent certain characters and what have you. Again, I think perhaps one of the reasons why I find myself hesitant to claim my work as being prog is because it's just not in a traditional sense like that. Synchestra was a quick and cathartic experiment in which a lot of things started coming together at one time. Another thing to say about Synchestra as well is the name. So, when I was a kid, when I was, again, during my 15-year-old foul-smelling teenage period, as opposed to my 48-year-old foul-smelling adult period, I listened to a lot of new age music. And, Enya or Emerald Webb or Kitaro or Paul Horn. It was as much a part of my listening as Metallica and Judas Priest and Tony McAlpine and Steve Vai. And one of the albums that I had bought, because at that time it was the cassettes, and without the internet it was very difficult to know what you were getting with that particular genre of music. There was no new age stations, and the ones that were there were all that sort of e-piano, I don't even know. I always described it as LA sounding new age music. It was all very happy and it's like Kenny G sort of thing. But what I really was interested in was like the minor key stuff. I forget the song, third song on Watermark by Enya. Second song, actually. Cursum Perificio. Or what was the other one that really did it for me on that record? Exile, I think it was called. But there was a cassette that I had picked up while taking a chance on something new. And I've looked for it online to see if it still existed, but I wonder if it was just like a local thing or just an independent release. But the album was called Synchestra, and it had this sort of a cartoon cover of brightly colored fields and mountains and things like this. And I didn't love the music, but I listened to it a lot. And from what I remember, it was just sort of constantly spiraling major arpeggios. And they would just sort of transform from key to key without much concern for what the key was before. And again, I've looked it up and I can't find it. But I always remember thinking that the one part about that album that I thought was really fantastic was that name. I love the idea of life being an orchestra of synchronicity. And so when it came time to do this, that became an inadvertent influence. So I had the nature imagery, and we had the nature sounds, and the idea of Synchestra, and then the tree on the cover, and the idea of the sunset. So throughout the layout, there is a lot of gold colors, and the artist did a great job. And it was very much an exercise for me in trying to get it done so that while I was on tour with Strapping Young Lad, I could listen to this and it would make me happy. Seems kind of absurd in hindsight. But I think, again, it acted as a very tangible balm to the chaos that I felt I had brought upon myself by allowing my trip to go to those places that Alien needed to go. So they exist, those two albums, side by side. Alien and Synchestra. They're, again, another set of brothers. When I look back at it now, where are we? Ocean Machine and City, we're a pair of brothers. SYL, Accelerated Evolution, we're a pair of brothers. Devlab and Hummer. Alien and Synchestra. Dark Matters and Sky Blue. Ghost and Deconstruction. I mean, it just goes on and on. I think that as opposed to that being indicative of some sort of theme that I was consciously trying to represent, I think it's, again, going back to my silly personality quiz that pegged me as being as simple as I think I've accepted since it. I think it really comes down to I just get bored of things. And if I'm doing one thing, not only do I get bored of it, but I become so single-minded and obsessive about the work that by the time I get to the finishing line for these projects, I want to hear things that sound nothing like that. So after Alien, there's no way that I would want to get back on the horse and make another brutal record. I just psychologically didn't have the interest in doing that. So a song like Sunshine and Happiness compared to Shitstorm, which some people would be indicative of some sort of mental issue on my behalf, is really a simple case of reacting to something and being like, oh, holy shit. After doing that, the only thing that I want to hear right now is the complete opposite. And that applies to Deconstruction and Ghost as well, very much. Like Deconstruction, by the time we get to talking about that, I mean, this whole period that we've been discussing over the past 8 podcasts, it all continues. It all just goes into that. And what Deconstruction was about this. And what Addicted was about this. In fact, going ahead in time just slightly, the Devin Townsend project, eventually, as the name would suggest, was about trying to get to the bottom of who it is that I am. And what that required was for me to sort of clear my mind of the chaos that I was putting into it. And then using that initial 4-record project, Key, Addicted, Deconstruction, and Ghost, as a way of retroactively describing what I was doing with these records that we're discussing now. And I felt it was important to do that for a number of reasons, but almost most importantly because I felt I had left it open for interpretation as to what my intentions were. And obviously, people are going to interpret things in the ways that they are going to interpret it. And there's nothing that as creators we can do about that in a lot of scenarios. But I wanted to be clear on my own part and in my own mind that I had, to the best of my ability, described what was going on during that process, even if that process implies a type of weakness to some people. Again, I think if we construct an identity for ourselves that we then spend the majority of our effort trying to protect people from ever knowing the truth, that is a lot of effort. And I think that as I get older, the things that are most important to me is just surrendering to who I am. And if that doesn't work for some people, it's got nothing to do with me at this point. This is Devin Townsend. Thanks for listening. I'll be back again. Please take care of yourself during this period. We'll get through it. Dev out.